Japan. The ideal utopia. A country that led the world in video game design through the 1980s. Of course, until 3D consoles came out in the mid-1990s and everything sort of went to hell, but nonetheless. A country where the math, reading, and science scores of school-aged children are forced through the roof, thanks to many hours of grueling study at cram schools. A country where it's possible to buy a girl's used underwear in a vending machine, and where overworked, undersexed salarymen sleep on the floor of the subway station after a long night of mandatory drinking with coworkers. A country with a stagnant birth rate and a rapidly aging population that now spends more money on adult diapers than they do on the little ones for babies. A country that for 3 straight decades, starting in the 1950s, rapidly outpaced the entire world in terms of economic growth and development by exporting vast quantities of low-cost, high-quality toys, cars, boats, radios, VCRs, indeed all manner of consumer electronics, to the world, but most especially the United States. And in the days after the Japanese surrendered to the US on September 2nd of 1945, effectively ending the Second World War, such an economic miracle would have been regarded as impossible. Years of warfare and intense bombing had reduced Japan's most important industrial centers to rubble. Yet the people of Japan were driven to restore their country to its former glory, and then some, through hard work, intense loyalty to the state, and the ingenuity of a new breed of entrepreneur staking out territory in emerging markets, such as the burgeoning semiconductor and electronics sector. Japan would, in the course of a single generation, rise up like a phoenix out of the ashes of destruction. Ashes of war and destruction that Japan totally started in the first place.
Someone just said Pearl Harbor's being attacked.
Pearl Harbor's being attacked.
Does anyone have a quarter? I gotta call my mom.
But like a Chinese B-5 rocket soaring towards the outer limits of Earth's atmosphere, eventually even the miraculous rise of Japan would have to come crashing back down to Earth. But before doing so, there is that one glorious moment in time, that one window, when it seems like maybe the law of gravity will be defied, just this once.
That hurt.
That glorious moment was, of course, the bubble economy of 1980s Japan. Japanese corporations were at the absolute height of their power, as Japan overtook the once mighty US steel and automotive industries. The loyal, hard-working employees of these companies were guaranteed lifetime employment, promotions based on seniority, and plush pensions upon retirement at the age of 55. Employees with stock options during this period would see the value of their personal assets mushroom in just a few years. The great wealth and optimism of Japan from this period can be intuited by anyone who's familiar with the breezy, upbeat sounds of city pop, the soundtrack to prosperity, just as much as New Wave was the musical backdrop to the cocaine-riddled party that was the 1980s in America. And what a party it was, all around. Japan bristled with elite nightclubs, where salarymen were known to spend tens of thousands of dollars in a single evening of extravagance. It was the decade of Tokyo Disneyland and indoor urban ski lifts. It was a time of great consumption and material excess as both Japanese citizens and Japanese corporations, backed by the ambitions of the post-war government, endlessly bought and consumed with a zeal that would have shocked the conservative sensibilities of their forefathers. Japanese housewives were buying $500 cups of coffee sprinkled with actual gold. The Mitsubishi Corporation bought New York City's Rockefeller Center for $846 million. It seemed as though Japan was destined to swallow America whole. And just as Japan was buying American real estate and businesses left and right, it was also in the 1980s that Japanese animation broke out to foreign markets, along with the newly invigorated video game industry, so as to make Japan an idol for millions of American youth who would myopically learn to view the former military dictatorship through the cartoon-shaded lens of pop culture. To us, to people such as myself, this mysterious country that once unsuccessfully tried to kill my grandfather and therefore snuff out my very existence on this planet was the very epitome of progress, culture, innovation, and above all else, animated boobs. Animated boobs everywhere. It was in this peculiar, exuberant climate that NEC and Hudson Soft brought forth one of the greatest video game consoles of the late 80s and early 90s, the PC Engine, offering radically updated graphics thanks to not one, but two 16-bit GPUs, and a custom processor developed by Hudson Soft engineers themselves. The PC Engine allowed gamers to play up to 2 different games at its launch on October 30th of 1987. Bakuramon World, a reskinned home port of Weststone's adorable Wonder Boy and Monsterland that was simultaneously a commercial tie-in with a popular children's television show that was itself based upon an even more popular line of snacks that came packed with collectible stickers. Bakuramon! The other game was Shanghai. This is Shanghai. It's mahjong, but you play it all by yourself. You probably have to be drinking to enjoy doing this. This is a little sad. The story goes that the PC Engine sold around 500,000 units in its first month on the market. Other sources sometimes report that it was 500,000 in the first week of its release. And with games like this, it's not terribly easy to see how. By the end of 1987, the PC Engine game lineup was still virtually dead, with only 5 different games in total. Count 'em, 5. And all developed in-house by Hudson Soft themselves. But according to virtually all popular sources, the PC Engine would become the #1 selling video game console in Japan for 1988, even beating out the immensely popular Nintendo Famicom, which had a virtual monopoly on video games at the time. This alleged feat was accomplished in spite of the fact that 1988 saw the release of only 21 additional games, 3 of which were exclusives for a brand new CD-ROM based add-on called the PC Engine CD-ROM. To put this 21 game number in perspective, just keep in mind that the Nintendo Famicom saw more than 140 releases in that same year. Looking at the launch library for the PC Engine in the first 14 months of the console's existence, there are a few decent games, but nothing truly spectacular, except for R-Type. How can this be? How does a console that only offers 26 more or less average games, 14 months after its release, become the #1 selling Japanese console in 1988?
今日はのりこのコンサートに来てくれて本当にありがとう。のりこはとっても感激しています。
あららら、歌も歌うってか？よし、これはな、刑事であるわしが。あっさば、あっさば、のりこちゃんとあっさば。警察に言うなよ。
The PC Engine was released during a golden moment in 1987. Nintendo's Famicom had reached the point of its market saturation, and the PC Engine debuted without competition for at least a year. But most importantly, the PC Engine launched at the very apex of the Japanese bubble economy, a time when Japanese people were spending money and racking up credit at an enormous rate. If there was ever a moment in the history of Japan to release a superfluous electronic amusement device that would sell regardless of its quality, then it was definitely in 1987. Ultimately, the PC Engine, despite having a strong start, never sold much more than 10.5 million units worldwide, a respectable number that was far below the astronomical 61 million units achieved by Nintendo's Famicom, or the more than 49 million units eventually achieved by the Super Nintendo, released in 1990. Indeed, by 1990, in anticipation of the release of the Super Nintendo, PC Engine sales would come crashing back down to earth. And it wasn't just PC Engine sales that started crashing either, because beginning January 1st, 1990, the Japanese bubble economy began to rapidly slide into a long period of economic stagnation and debt that would come to be known as the Lost Decade. The bubble economy of the late 1980s had finally burst. The credit ran out, the real estate schemes dried up, and when it was time to pay the piper, a chain of debt and foreclosed assets rippled like a shockwave through the Japanese economy, until even the country's largest banks found themselves desperately borrowing money from each other that simply did not exist in reality. Soon the government was ushered in to rescue the banks and absorb a mountain of debt that was, in turn, ultimately passed on to the Japanese people themselves. The consequence of all of this was a poorer than expected Japanese populace that had far less free spending money than the Japanese people of the mid to late 80s. And had a PC Engine been launched anywhere near the 1990 release date for the Super Nintendo, then I have no doubt in my mind that it would have failed miserably. Though the PC Engine itself would eventually reach commercial obsolescence by the early 90s, one must admit that it had quite the run at the tail end of the 80s. Anyone familiar with the console and the sterling reputation of its creators at NEC and Hudson Soft would have expected great things for the console upon hearing the news that it was destined to be exported to the United States. Alas, as we all know, that was not the case. After being repackaged as the TurboGrafx-16, it's believed that the console never sold more than 300,000 units, making it one of the worst-selling high-profile video game consoles of all time. And it's not like we can blame the Japanese bubble economy either, because the United States was not so affected by Japan's economic collapse and stagnation. So, what happened? Why did the TurboGrafx-16 fail in America, while the PC Engine was at least a modest success in Japan? They were essentially the exact same video game console. They had access to the same game library. They were developed, manufactured, and supported by the same two companies, both of which were highly reputable within their own spheres of influence. NEC was well known for making quality computers and consumer electronics, and Hudson Soft was well known for making quality games. Can someone please explain why the TurboGrafx-16 failed in North America? So who can we ask? To whom does one go when thou hast nothing left to give? The Shmup Junkie. Who is the Shmup Junkie, you ask? He is YouTube's rising star, a meticulous purveyor of side-scrolling space shooters from the 80s and 90s. Shmup Junkie has amassed nearly 10,000 subscribers and nearly 500,000 views in less than a year. I'm also pretty sure that he's not an actual junkie. I think. But he is a master of the craft, educating the masses in how not to suck at Ninja Gaiden, whether or not you should buy a TurboGrafx-16 Mini, and giveaways. Who doesn't love a good old-fashioned giveaway? On April 25th of this year, rising YouTube superstar Shmup Junkie threw his knickers into the laundry basket of YouTube and offered an answer to this mystery of the TurboGrafx when he uploaded not one but two 24-minute long videos. And the responses to these lengthy essays have been overwhelmingly positive, garnering nearly 30,000 views in total, and the adulation of many middle-aged men who know exactly what I'm talking about when I say Bedhead 1000. So what? What do we, CCP, have to do with any of this? Why are we making a video about Shmup Junkie's history of the TurboGrafx-16 and why it failed in North America? Well, because we also published a video about why the TurboGrafx-16 failed in North America back in September of 2019, and Shmup Junkie not only makes reference to our video without ever really giving us credit, which is fine, that's fine, but he also goes out of his way to completely dismiss our video. In fact, he called our explanation for why the TurboGrafx-16 failed trash. Okay, well, maybe that's not so fine. We take umbrage with this response to our video, and we don't think that our arguments are so easily dismissed as trash. And at the same time, we think that the Shmup Junkie has made some miscalculations of his own that need to be addressed, or at the very least, clarified. Now, if you've never seen either of our videos about the failure of the TurboGrafx-16, then by all means, check out our original video on why the TurboGrafx-16 failed in North America. And also check out Shmup Junkie's 2-video series on the history of the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16. I'll provide the links for all these videos in the description of this one. But for those who ain't got the time, I'll briefly summarize the argument of our own TurboGrafx video as follows. Let me ask you, what makes a successful video game console? It's the quality of the games, baby! Yeah, you know it! It's all about the gameplay! That high voltage rolling birdcage of thunder and lightning! Woo, yeah! And of course, it's also a matter of the price. But you know you need that thunder, baby! The games that got the thrills, spills, chills, endless rampage and death squadron over 1,000 kills, yeah! And once again, at a reasonable competitive price point. And you know we're right! It's not the name of the console. The Wii is one of the dumbest names for a game console in history, and yet it's also one of the most successful. The TurboGrafx-16 is possibly the greatest name for a console ever, and yet it just didn't sell. It's not how early the console came to the market with the promise of being the next generation. The Saturn beat the PlayStation in the US by many months, and yet it failed miserably. The first 64-bit console, allegedly, was the Atari Jaguar, and no one cared. The Super Nintendo was late to the 16-bit market by 2 years, and while it took a while to catch up, it ultimately outsold the Sega Genesis by nearly 40% worldwide. And it's not the design of the console. Again, the TurboGrafx-16 looks badass, but the Nintendo Switch is quite possibly the ugliest, most unimaginative piece of hardware that I've ever seen. And yet it's also one of the most successful of all time too. And it's not whether or not the console is the most powerful on the market either. Again, the Switch isn't really what you'd call next-gen hardware, and yet everyone loves it. Neither was the Wii back in the day. The 3DO, on the other hand, was truly ahead of its time. So far ahead of its time that it was dead on arrival. The only two things that matter for a console's ability to survive in the competitive marketplace are its library of available games and the prices. If the game library is good and can't be replicated elsewhere, then people will be interested. The way people were super interested after they saw the games for the Neo Geo.
Badass! Those games look awesome!
But if the console and game library are too far afield of what people are willing to pay, then people will go elsewhere, just as they did with the $650 Neo Geo and its $120 video game cartridges.
$650? What a bummer!
For a console to actually be successful, the only two things that matter are good exclusive games on the shelves and a price tag that can flexibly match the competition. The TurboGrafx-16 had pretty good games when it launched in the summer of 1989 in North America, but it failed because gamers, or more likely their parents, perceived the relative cost for the console to be way too high. This is because the TurboGrafx-16 was launched and marketed alongside a wide variety of additional hardware that ramped up the cost of what NEC in America was calling the Total Turbo System. This included, in addition to the TurboGrafx console itself, a turbo tap in order to play multiplayer games, including 2-player, a turbo booster if you wanted stereo output and composite cable connections for a better picture on your television, and the infamous $400 turbo CD, so that you could access the full range of games that were advertised as being available for the system. The sum total of this so-called total turbo system was in excess of $700. $700 in 1989. In 1989, when compared to either the incredibly popular NES or even the brand new Sega Genesis, both of which contained everything you needed to play all of their games right out of the box, the cost of the TurboGrafx-16 was simply ludicrous. Very few people were going to buy all of that superfluous expensive hardware when they didn't have to. To illustrate this point, our video featured a comical animated sequence depicting a hypothetical conversation between a clueless suburban dad and a slightly less clueless Toys R Us store clerk. The dad wanted to buy a video game console as a Christmas present for his son, but there was no way he was going to be able to make sense of all of the expensive and confusing hardware that surrounded the TurboGrafx-16. So, instead he opted for the simplest, cheapest console that all of the parents and kids already knew about, the NES. The punchline was that because the NES was sold out, which it frequently was in real life back then, he therefore had to settle on a Sega Genesis by default. The true story about how kids in America wound up with a Sega Genesis the Christmas of 1989. We thought our video was pretty good, and indeed a lot of you did too, because it's one of the most popular videos on our channel. And for a video about an obscure video game console that faded out over 30 years ago, it's been seen by quite a few people, and that's including the Shmup Junkie. But let's talk about Shmup Junkie's video. Shmup Junkie's first video is essentially a sentimental celebration of everything good about the PC Engine and TurboGrafx, seasoned with copious amounts of dramatic game music and widescreen images of gameplay and cutscenes from both consoles. It's an aesthetically pleasing experience, and it gives one the impression that the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 were just incredible, amazing pieces of hardware through and through, with a stunning bounty of great games. He highlights the high points of the console, pointing out the compact size of the PC Engine and its expandability thanks to a port on the back of the console that allowed for hardware upgrades. He points out that the console outsold the Nintendo Famicom and the Sega Genesis in 1988. The first reference I think he makes to our video comes when he talks about the PC Engine's launch game, Bakuramon, and how it was a big deal in Japan in the mid-80s thanks to the Bakuramon TV show and snack product. To my knowledge, there are no other YouTube videos or articles on the internet that discuss the connection outside of our own, and we would know because we had to research this topic exhaustively to put together the narrative that we did. The reason we had to research and talk about this topic in the first place was that while the PC Engine is widely said to have been an instant smash hit in Japan, selling like 500,000 units in the first few weeks, there really doesn't seem to be any good reason for why that would have been true, if it in fact actually is true. The PC Engine launched with only 2 games, and neither of them were really that good. You see, we had to invent the story about the PC Engine selling through the roof because of the popularity of the Bakuramon snack and TV show, as a way of trying to make sense of the few blurry facts that existed about the early days of the console. What we did was take a plausible explanation based on evidence that Bakuramon was popular in the 80s and utilize it as the best possible way to elucidate our narrative, given the universally accepted idea that the PC Engine was a runaway smash hit upon its debut in 1987. The only other possible explanation is that the console just wasn't as popular as we've all been told, and we had no reason at the time to doubt that. But Shmup Junkie seems to have taken our version of the story at face value, because it wound up in his own overview of the PC Engine's strengths as a console that exploited what was cool and popular in Japan. And cool in Japan pretty much summarizes the rest of his explanation for the popularity of the PC Engine in general, as well as its subsequent failure as the TurboGrafx-16 in the US. It had a bunch of space shooters, and games featuring anime characters that were popular in Japan. Ergo, the Japanese liked it. Americans aren't Japanese, we didn't watch anime, and therefore we didn't like it. Case closed? Well, obviously not so much, because Americans plainly love Japanese video games, and in the late 80s and early 90s, Japanese video games were pretty much all American console gamers even knew. Sonic the Hedgehog is Japanese. Super Mario Bros. Is Japanese, and plenty of gamers in the US enjoyed anime by 1990, even if they didn't realize it. Thundercats was essentially an example of anime, though it had a multinational production team. Similarly, the incredibly popular first season of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was actually animated by Toei, the same studio that produced Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon, two shows that would be every bit as popular in the US as they were in Japan within a few years. We can't claim the PC Engine failed in the US because of its Japaneseness, because the Japaneseness of video games was an inescapable reality, and Japanese video games were already broadly popular in America. They had been for years. Now maybe you could argue that Japan likes shooters a lot more, and the PC Engine had a bunch of shooters, and therefore that's why it succeeded over there. But that's not so clear either, because plenty of Americans also love shooters. And the truth is that in the early critical years prior to the launch of the Super Famicom, the point at which the PC Engine would basically cease to be relevant, it didn't really have an inordinate number of shooters. It had a lot of shooters, but so too did the Mega Drive, and so would the Super Famicom, if we're being honest. Within the first year of the Super Famicom's launch in Japan, a significant percentage of its games were all traditional space shooters. Raiden Densetsu, Super Earth Defense Force, Hyperzone, Area 88, Super R-Type, Darius Twin, and Gradius 3, which was practically a launch game. The point is that while yes, the PC Engine had a lot of shooters by the early 90s, there just isn't anything special about a video game console having a lot of shooters. They all did. Shmup Junkie does show an interesting graphic indicating that the PC Engine had 117 total shooters, something like 20% of the total games made for the console. And this is compared to the PlayStation 1, Saturn, and Mega Drive, which had much fewer. But I think there's a good explanation for that, and that's that these consoles had lifespans that were beyond the point that the fighting game genre took over the arcades. By the time the PlayStation 1 and Saturn were launched in the mid-90s, the shooting genre was more or less dead. The PC Engine's most relevant lifespan was from October 1987 to November of 1990, hovering right over the apex of the space shooting arcade genre. The PC Engine, in this way, was really just a product of its time. I love these games too, and there's no doubt that the PC Engine is a great place to experience some fantastic shooters. It's just that I don't think there was anything particularly deliberate, strategic, or even special about the fact that the PC Engine has a lot of shooters. But still, at the same time, 117 is pretty amazing, and you really do have to love the PC Engine for its unique games like Gate of Thunder, Gunhead, and the Soldier Blade series. Shmup Junkie concludes the first of his two videos by, once again, highlighting the features of the PC Engine that he sees as being unique to Japan and Japaneseness. The argument being, once again, that what was cool in Japan wasn't cool in America. Which is, of course, absurd, since video games from that time are plainly Japanese, and we were all, obviously, very much aware of that fact. He even mentions Transformers as something uniquely American. But bro, Transformers were imported from Japan. The cultural stream between the US and Japan was pretty well established at this point, including comic books and pro wrestling, two other American things that Japanese people absolutely love. But then, just as his first video ends, and he starts to segue to the second, he references our video about the TurboGrafx-16 once again.
Theories abound, from blaming the expensive CD attachment to parents being confused by the advertising and accessories. There's just one thing. they're mostly rubbish.
Rubbish? Our explanation about the failure of the TurboGrafx-16 is rubbish? Really? I mean, it can't be worse than postulating that Americans just didn't like Japanese stuff in 1989, like the Sony Walkman, or the NES, or arcade games, or Transformers, or fake martial arts, or real martial arts, or reliable cars, or good cameras, or animated boobs, or eating sushi, or ninjas, or animated boobs. I was so taken aback by Shmup Junkie dumping on our video as trash, and yet simultaneously deeply touched that a rising YouTube star had both seen and thought about one of our videos, that I went on Twitter to let Shmup Junkie know that we looked forward to part 2, because it was going to mention us, the people with the trash theory about the TurboGrafx-16 failing due to confused parents and the expensive CD add-ons. Realizing that Shmup Junkie was a channel with around 9,000 subscribers, I inquired as to whether or not he'd be mentioning or talking about our channel explicitly in his second video. He said, "If I could get Johnny Turbo with actual interview footage, you know I would." Huh? I went ahead and let him know that we were looking forward to his follow-up. I really wanted to know why he thought our hypothesis was trash. Then on May 9th of 2021, the second video was uploaded to YouTube. I'm so excited. Is Shmup Junkie gonna drop our name? Is he gonna make fun of our terrible animation? What's he gonna say? It was Sega. Sega did it. That's the big secret that we completely missed. No one in America bought a TurboGrafx-16 because the Sega Genesis was so successful that it displaced the console from the marketplace. Case closed? Shmup Junkie points out, as is widely reported, that the PC Engine outsold the Sega Mega Drive in Japan, so it probably took NEC and Hudson Soft by surprise when they found themselves underselling against the Sega Mega Drive, now renamed the Sega Genesis, in the United States. Was it NEC's fault that this happened? Or was it just that Tom Kalinske, the CEO of Sega of America, was just so good at his job? I think the key to understanding Shmup Junkie's perspective from this point on, and indeed most of our content about the history of the PC Engine, is a very popular article that was published on a website called Gama Sutra on September 12th of 2014. For those who don't know, Gama Sutra is the sister publication to Game Developer Magazine, and it's essentially an insider's forum for people in the game industry to blog about their thoughts on various topics within the realm of video game marketing, development, or history. Though it's also a news source with its own team of journalists who do all the typical stuff that game publications do. In this case, in 2014, Christian Nutt of Gama Sutra published a lengthy article about the history of the TurboGrafx-16 titled "Stalled Engine, the TurboGrafx-16 Turns 25." To generate this article, Christian Nutt interviewed numerous former executives at both NEC of America and Hudson Soft in order to piece together, at least from an English speaker's point of view, exactly how it was that the TurboGrafx-16 failed in North America. Included in this article are comments from Rich O'Keefe, a former NEC engineer, John Grainer, the former head of Hudson Soft in the US, Ken Wirt, a member of the TurboGrafx-16's launch team, Carol Balcom, a former NEC marketing executive, Victor Ireland, a game publisher and founder of Working Designs, and John Brandstetter, aka Johnny Turbo, an NEC marketing executive who would eventually head Turbo Technologies in 1991 and was famous for having his own comic strip. Rather than simply present a bunch of separate interviews about the TurboGrafx-16, Christian Nutt decided to rework all of the various comments into a single chronological narrative from beginning to end. This makes for an engaging story, but it also makes extracting the actual facts about what happened out of all of the contradictory testimony from all of these different people quite difficult. Each of these people bring their own perspective on the history of the console, and each have their own take as to why the console ultimately failed. There is a common theme here, however, and that's the need to deflect blame. Many of the statements and key points made in this Gama Sutra article appear repeatedly in Shmup Junkie's video, as well as my own video. because this exact article is the single most important source for pretty much every other article or video attempting to address this question over the last 6 or 7 years. From the interviews that were used to make this very article comes the entire origin story for the PC Engine as we know it. How the engineers at Hudson Soft wanted to upgrade the Nintendo, only to be turned away, and then eventually picked up for a joint venture with NEC. Also, we find the idea that the PC Engine was a huge hit in Japan, which in turn made NEC overconfident, and so they overproduced 750,000 consoles to bring to the American market in 1989. Also, there's the idea that the PC Engine would have succeeded if only NEC of America didn't mismanage its launch, which was delayed by months so that NEC could rename and redesign the console to be appealing to Americans. Then there's the charge that NEC executives didn't import the right games, or not enough games, or that they were somehow letting their kids pick which games to bring to the US, which is more or less just hearsay. Then there's the claim that Hudson Soft hurt the console's future by specifically offending Electronic Arts at a conference for potential developers, as if the loss of Electronic Arts games in 1989 would have actually mattered. I guess some people just really loved Skate or Die. Then there's the famous story about how Mortal Kombat was supposedly intended to be an exclusive game for the TurboGrafx, but NEC of Japan just wouldn't cooperate, or that NEC of Japan just couldn't understand America or the American marketplace. And there's the claim that NEC just didn't spend enough money in advertising, even though the same article points out that they spent about $10 million, which was about as much as Sega around the same time period. And finally, there's the popular claim that the box art was poopy, and that the console's pack-in game was so bad that it ruined the launch. Many points regarding the failure of the console are made, but ultimately, no final conclusions are drawn by Christian Nutt or any of the people interviewed, and we're still left wondering, what in the hell happened? If you watch our video about the TurboGrafx-16, you'll find that we addressed most of these claims made within the Gamasutra article, rejecting the ones we think are patently absurd. First off is the claim regarding the bad marketing, such as the supposed lack of advertising spending, or the existence of bad box art. Traditionally, this is the story that most people tell on the internet about the TurboGrafx-16, but it just doesn't hold up. Even the Gamasutra article points out that the advertising budget for the TurboGrafx-16 was $10 million, and it's really easy to find tons of print ads and commercials that were generated for the console. Plus, the console was heavily featured in all of the popular gaming publications of the time period. We all knew about the console back then. We just mostly decided not to buy it, which means unlike Sega and Nintendo, there wasn't much ground for a lasting legacy. As for the box art, well, it was hit or miss. The NES and Genesis also had bad box art from time to time, and not all of the PC Engine box art was so bad. This argument is weak as well. The claim that a delayed launch irreparably hurt the TurboGrafx-16 is also not persuasive. The name change was probably a really good idea, since PC Engine is admittedly a really confusing name that sounds like the farthest thing from a video game console. It kinda sounds like a woke contemporary children's book.
Come on, kids, hop on board the PC Engine. Choo-choo.
Further, the design of the console, while kinda big and clunky, is also pretty badass in my opinion. But most importantly, we should all know by now that being late to a console launch doesn't spell doom, any more than being early means success. There's the famous example of how the Saturn tried to beat the PlayStation by being early, only to alienate both gamers and merchants at the same time. And despite talk about how great Sega did in the early 90s, it still ultimately fell short of the success that was the Super Nintendo, even though that console was released a full 2 years later. The Mortal Kombat story seems pretty far-fetched to me, given the fact that NEC stopped officially supporting the TurboGrafx in 1991, a full year before the arcade game was even launched. I'm totally sure Midway wanted their blockbuster game to be an exclusive for a dead console. That story is just crazy, and so is the EA story if we're being honest. So Hudson Soft allegedly offended EA by asking them whether or not they could actually make good video games. But honestly, that's a fair question. Even in 1989, EA wasn't exactly known for great games. Western developers wouldn't make or break a console until the rise of the Sony PlayStation, but in the late 80s and early 90s, the only game studios producing consistent quality hits were all from Japan. This was also true for the Genesis and the Nintendo, except in the case of Rare, which of course made Nintendo a lot of money in the mid to late 90s. I guess Road Rash and Desert Strike were pretty good, but I wouldn't call these games essential or truly great. And then there's the claim that NEC was mismanaged or that they didn't import enough games. And in our video I talk about how that's not true either, at least not until long after NEC abandoned the TurboGrafx-16 in 1991. The truth is, outside of the PC Engine CD games, which were never relevant in the US market, according to the same article they only sold like 20,000 Turbo CD-ROM drives, almost every regular cartridge-based game that wasn't an RPG was brought stateside. An explanation that is not explicitly found within the Gamasutra article, however, is the one about expensive and confusing hardware ramping up the perceived price tag of the TurboGrafx-16 so much that it rendered the console cost prohibitive. There is the admission that after the initial failure of the TurboGrafx-16 in the fall of 1989, that the console was marketed as high-end expensive gaming equipment. It's compared to the luxury car market, like it's the Lexus of video games or something. But at no point is there any admission that upselling the console as expensive luxury hardware could have played a role in making it uncompetitive. And that is essentially our own hypothesis in a nutshell. The TurboGrafx-16 launched simultaneously with so much costly hardware, marketed as fundamental to the complete experience, the so-called total turbo system, that it drove up the perceived cost of the console beyond $700, far beyond most people's breaking point. Nowhere else have I read anyone point this out. This was what we decided was the most likely explanation after looking at all of these competing scenarios and arguments that were available to us. The simplest and we think best explanation: it just cost too much money to have a fully functional game system. Now I know Shmup Junkie disagrees, because his videos flaunt the so-called flexibility of the PC Engine, insofar as it had this big expansion port that allowed you to upgrade the console by way of a $400 CD-ROM drive, and that it offered all of these RAM expansion cards for playing newer games. Flexibility is one way of looking at it, but I actually think it's a weakness and not a strength. All that extra hardware dumped on the market actually harmed the PC Engine's ability to compete with other consoles that offered high-quality games without requiring secondary and costly thresholds for entry. Costly thresholds for both consumers and game developers, who were much happier sticking with making games for systems that had the biggest consumer base possible. This is probably why the PC Engine CD-ROM add-on only sold around 1 million units. And this same attempt to bolster a pre-existing console by creating add-ons has been done other times, and it always seems to end in failure. Nintendo tried to push a disk drive add-on for the Famicom, for which the original Legend of Zelda was created. It failed so badly that they didn't even bother releasing it in the United States, and Zelda was reworked as a cartridge title. Sega's attempt to enhance the Genesis with the Sega CD and 32X add-ons went so poorly that many people, including myself, regard their existence as the beginning of the end for Sega's run as a console maker. That sums up the content of the Gamasutra article by Christian Nutt, and the massive role that it plays in informing the discussion about the TurboGrafx-16's history. As far as trying to understand what happened to the console and why it failed, it's more than just a really important article. It's essentially the Rosetta Stone of PC Engine history. Without that article and those interviews, none of us would have very much to say about this topic at all. And keeping this in mind, let's look at the rest of Shmup Junkie's second video, the one where he takes out the trash. From here on out, he's going to lean on all sorts of talking points that come straight out of the Gamasutra article. There's the claim that NEC of Japan and Hudson didn't understand the US game market, whatever that means. Then there's the famous story about how Electronic Arts was supposedly so butthurt by comments regarding the quality of their games that they walked out of a conference for TurboGrafx developers hosted by Hudson Soft. Then there's the talk about NEC's overconfidence and the manufacturing of 750,000 consoles which was supposedly money that should have gone into increasing the $10 million budget spent on advertising, which is something Sega did. Again, this is all taken from the Gamasutra article. Then there's the claim that NEC had lost their early advantage because of redesigning and rebranding the console as the TurboGrafx-16, straight from Gamasutra. Shmup Junkie talks about the choice of launch game, Gamasutra, then he says something kinda different. He points out that the Turbo CD cost too much money, and that it only launched with 2 lackluster games. That's not the Gamasutra article, and I happen to agree. And he points out that the TurboGrafx launch lineup was actually pretty good, even compared to the Sega Genesis. I also agree. But then he paraphrases the Gamasutra article again, indicating that NEC should have reinvested their money into further marketing, since, as the Gamasutra article indicates, Sega supposedly did just that. There's a problem with that idea that we'll get into in a moment. But then finally, just before we hit the 6-minute mark, he asks why it failed in America.
It wasn't the lack of big-name games. It wasn't the lack of a second controller port needing a $20 adapter. Nor was it confusing advertising. All of these things did matter, of course, and they did contribute, along with many other mistakes by NEC. But NEC wasn't the only reason, or the biggest reason, the TurboGrafx launch went poorly.
I already told you. He says it's Sega. Specifically, he believes that it was Sega's leadership under Sega of America president Tom Kalinske that defeated the TurboGrafx-16. Even more specifically, he believes it was Sega's memorable aggressive marketing campaign that did the trick.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Commercials. If only the PC Engine had more edgy, aggressive commercials. I'm not buying it. Why? Remember that I said I doubted that Sega had some kind of advantage early on in the life of the Genesis because they reallocated profits for more marketing. That's because I've read Console Wars by Blake J. Harris, which is probably the single best comprehensive history of video games in the early 90s, but probably mostly by default. In Console Wars, you learn that initially, in spite of Sega of America spending huge amounts of money on celebrity endorsements for the Genesis, endorsements from guys like Tommy Lasorda and Arnold Palmer, the Genesis just didn't sell all that well, not in the beginning. It turns out that in the summer of 1989, in spite of there being 2 brand new cutting-edge video game consoles on the market, most Americans still preferred Nintendo by a very wide margin. After all, the Nintendo had a large game library, brand recognition, cost less, and was in the midst of releasing some of its very best games, including Ninja Gaiden, Mega Man 2, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Dragon Warrior, DuckTales, Tetris, Double Dragon 2, River City Ransom, Batman, and Super Mario Bros. 3. All of these games were released within 6 months of the debut of the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis, both. Neither system, being as expensive as they were, could realistically compete with this game lineup. It was too good. This is why Michael Katz left his job as the president of Sega of America. Sega of Japan blamed him for overspending on celebrity endorsements and failing to get the ball rolling in America. Tom Kalinske, a famous toy executive, was brought in and given unprecedented leverage to do whatever he wanted, for the sole reason that Sega was desperate. But it wasn't the fact that Tom Kalinske spent even more money on crazy ad campaigns that changed Sega's fortunes. It was his decision to drastically cut the price of the Sega Genesis and change the pack-in game to Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991. Once the Sega Genesis moved from $189 to $150, with the inclusion of the very popular Sonic the Hedgehog game, Sega's console sales began to skyrocket in the United States. The TurboGrafx followed after, with its own drastic price cut to $99. But in a year that also saw the release of the Super Nintendo, a console that would ultimately outsell both the PC Engine and the Sega Genesis, in spite of its late arrival, there just wasn't much more that could be done to save NEC and Hudson Soft's joint venture. No one wanted it, and by no one I mean NEC, more so than either Hudson Soft or gamers. Now, a lot of people credit Tom Kalinske with saving Sega, at least in the US during the first half of the 1990s. But I think his track record is far spottier than people give him credit for. A lot of people will bring up the story about how Sega of Japan was actually really pissed off with Tom Kalinske's drastic price cut of the Genesis. And there might be good reason for that, because it's not entirely obvious that Sega of America was actually very profitable in the 1990s. Alongside climbing hardware and cartridge sales, Sega also kept pushing the ads. And while we look back on them now through the lens of nostalgia, the truth is, they were kinda condescending and stupid. As a Genesis fan, I felt like a jackass being associated with trash advertisements like this.
Next generation gaming platform, revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay, all with amazing new 3D experiences never before possible on home game systems. Wow.
Further, Kalinske dumped huge amounts of money into the Sega Technical Institute, Sega of America's very own domestic first-party developer that over the years, in spite of having a big fancy headquarters and a giant team of young energetic people, failed to produce a single video game that wasn't complete dog crap. Maybe you could argue that the Ooze or Comic Zone were okay, but okay doesn't cut the mustard when this kind of California real estate was looming over your head. Finally, Tom Kalinske was a big proponent of the 32X, easily the dumbest decision Sega ever made in its lengthy history, and a topic worthy of its own video. But long story short, the 32X's only accomplishment was to alienate hundreds of thousands, if not millions of loyal Sega customers, while simultaneously splitting Sega in two, so that they were forced not only to compete against the competition, but also their own Sega Saturn. It's like trying to win a fight while your left hand is simultaneously punching yourself repeatedly in the nuts. It's just not possible. It's probably not a coincidence that soon after the launch of the Sega Saturn, just a few years after taking the job as president of Sega of America, that Tom Kalinske resigned, having lasted with the company just long enough to take all of the credit without having to take on any of the blame for the imminent death of the company. But the main reason I think that Shmup Junkie is incorrect in crediting Tom Kalinske with the death of the PC Engine in America is that by 1990, the PC Engine was effectively already doomed. And by the time Tom Kalinske made his big Sonic the Hedgehog breakthrough in 1991, the console was already officially abandoned by NEC of Japan. Shmup Junkie states that he believes that Nintendo was never able to dethrone Sega in North America. That's actually not true. From 1991 through 1993, Sega maintained a lead against Nintendo in console sales. But in 1994, 1995, and 1996, the Super Nintendo curb-stomped Sega, thanks in large part to mega hits from Rare, such as the Donkey Kong Country series and the Killer Instinct fighting game, which was a really big deal back in the day. Even after the release of the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, the Super Nintendo continued to make more money for Nintendo in both console and game sales than Sega. And don't forget the fact that during the same time period, the Nintendo Game Boy was a runaway hit with its own legacy of success, ultimately selling nearly 119 million units worldwide. Sega's Game Gear, by comparison, was considered an abject failure, selling a mere 10.5 million units. If any video game company deserves credit for wiping out the TurboGrafx-16, then it's probably Nintendo, not Sega. Even though it was on the market since 1987, the PC Engine never managed to sell much more than 10.5 million units, including the TurboGrafx-16. That's a respectable figure that puts it about on par with the Sega Saturn, the Sega Master System, and the Game Gear. 3 consoles that most people regard as failures. But the Super Nintendo ended up selling in excess of 49 million units worldwide. In 1992, NEC would put out the Turbo Duo console that combined the Super CD-ROM drive and the PC Engine into a single device. This would ultimately sell less than 2 million units worldwide. And while almost 2 million is certainly a very large number, it's terrible in the video game industry. The 3DO sold 2 million units, and it's widely regarded as a dumpster fire. The Nintendo GameCube sold nearly 22 million units, and people lamented this like it was the death of the company. Yet as horrible as that number is, it's still roughly 11 times more than the Turbo Duo. All of this makes me wonder quite skeptically about the claim that the PC Engine was ever really all that successful in Japan in the first place. Perhaps according to one measure, new console sales, and perhaps for a couple of years before the Super Nintendo was released, but not overall, not in the grand scheme of things. But continuing on with Shmup Junkie's video, he's not pointing the blame at Nintendo but Sega, and he's got the idea that if Tom Kalinske had been the CEO of NEC of America, that maybe the tables would have been reversed. And that's an interesting thought. I don't know, maybe Kalinske could have packed in Bonk's Adventure with the console instead of Keith Courage. Unfortunately, NEC never sold that first batch of 750,000 consoles, so they were pretty much perpetually stuck with 750,000 copies of Keith Courage packed in with every unit. But still, one can dream. But was the TurboGrafx really a failure, he asks? I mean, isn't it really, in the end, all about the games? And you have to admit, at face value, there are some amazing games that were released for the TurboGrafx-16 and PC Engine both. And today many of these games still get a lot of attention as being some of the very best in their respective genres. I think to highlight this point as part of his dramatic opener for this series, he features an assortment of some of the best characters to ever appear on the PC Engine and TurboGrafx consoles. Bonk from Bonk's Adventure, Adol from the PC Engine CD-ROM RPG Ys Books 1 and 2, Richter from Castlevania Dracula X The Rondo of Blood, and the R9 Arrowhead from R-Type. Bonk, Adol, Richter, and the R9 Arrowhead are all great video game avatars. However, their juxtaposition by Shmup Junkie here is also emblematic of a mistake that we retro gamers commonly make when we look back at our old consoles and past video game experiences. These games have all been cherry-picked. In the end, no matter what their merits may be, every video game console is, in fact, ultimately judged by the quality of its game library. But there are two different ways of looking at the past when it comes to assessing the quality of a video game console's library. The perspective Shmup Junkie has adopted for the sake of his video series is that of the contemporary video game collector who stands over the complete catalog of a game console when passing judgment. Since the console's game library is historically and permanently settled, they have the luxury of simply abstracting all of that console's very best games, as if they were all equally representative of what that console was actually like when it was still on the store shelves. For collectors, this is obviously the best perspective, because their goal is to prioritize all of the best games from a given console's history. However, when people look back to do these historical overviews about video game consoles from the past, this anachronistic synoptic overview of the complete game library is also blinding. This is because historically, people who were actually faced with buying these consoles off of the store shelves didn't have access to that console's future complete game library, or even the past game library, as earlier titles would no doubt eventually fade from store shelves entirely. Gamers were instead faced with making comparisons mostly on the basis of what was physically in front of them at the moment of their purchase. This is especially true of the retro game consoles that had life cycles predating the popular use of the internet. The PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 are both this type of console. Shmup Junkie's cast of awesome characters and badass games for the PC Engine give the false impression that the PC Engine, at all times, was just a bountiful assortment of gaming perfection. But that, again, is the synoptic view of the collector. But how would you have actually experienced these games as a gamer in the late 80s had you actually gotten one of these consoles? Bonk, Richter, Adol, and the R9 Arrowhead. If you were a Japanese gamer in October of 1987 and you were looking at the brand new PC Engine, and this almost certainly meant you were a little Japanese boy, maybe named Yoshi, then you wouldn't meet any of these characters for at least 5 months. None of them. R-Type 1 Part 1 was released on March 25th, 1988. The second half of that game was released 2 months later on June 3rd of the same year. For PC Engine, the flagship mascot and one of the console's true must-have games, you would have had to wait until December 1989, more than 2 years after the PC Engine came out. You also would have been able to buy Ys Books 1 and 2 in December of 1989, but that's only if you also purchased the expensive CD-ROM add-on that allowed you to play the CD games. It's estimated that less than 10% of PC Engine owners actually owned that peripheral. And everybody loves Richter Belmont from Dracula X: The Rondo of Blood, but that game didn't appear until October of 1993, a full 6 years after the launch of the original PC Engine, and nearly 3 years after the launch of the incredibly successful Super Famicom by Nintendo. Further, you would have had to either own the upgraded Super CD-ROM drive, or both a PC Engine CD-ROM drive and a special RAM expansion card called the Super System Card, or the PC Engine Duo console, which was released in 1991, and combined all of these add-ons into a single new device. This is tantamount to having to purchase an entirely brand new video game console, which again, only a small percentage of PC Engine owners ever did. In other words, Richter Belmont, as cool as he is, doesn't really factor into how the vast majority of people actually experience the PC Engine in real life. And all of these other characters are similarly divided by large swaths of time and hardware barriers. And when we're asking ourselves whether these consoles were good or not, or if we want to try to get at why they failed or succeeded, we need to keep this in mind. The truth is, comparing game libraries on the basis of what was actually available at the time, the NES was way better than the PC Engine. Many of the must-have, coolest-looking games for the PC Engine wouldn't be released until way too late to save the console, or they'd be released for the CD-ROM drive, effectively guaranteeing that the PC Engine's legacy would be niche for all time immemorial. I'm not saying that Shmup Junkie doesn't understand this. I'm only pointing this out for the sake of clarity going forward, because his videos about the TurboGrafx-16 here are definitely intended to be kind of a positive celebration of the console. And that's totally valid in its own right, insofar as we're limiting ourselves to a celebration of the console. But these videos are definitely supposed to be more than that, because he's also reaching for an explanatory argument, namely discerning why such a stupendously awesome video game console, the same console that had Dracula X: The Rondo of Blood, also ended up being such a failure. And if we whitewash the console's game library, or we cherry-pick the absolute best games out of their historic context and just dump them in front of the viewer, we obfuscate the truth of our narrative. And we might miss out on the simplest possible explanation, namely, maybe the PC Engine failed in America because the game library just wasn't as good as we like to believe it was. Not in the place and time that it actually mattered. That's a possibility too. I mean, not everyone is blown away by the prospect of video pinball. After more celebration of the console, Shmup Junkie finally gets down to talking about the sad fact that the console failed miserably in the United States, and that NEC would pull out of the US market starting in 1991. And that's where we get yet another talking point from the Gamasutra article, which is the notion that NEC would create a subsidiary called TTI, or Turbo Technologies, out of the respect for the fans who already bought the console. Really? No way, man. I don't think that's what NEC was thinking at all. I think they were probably thinking, we have this massive unsold inventory of hundreds of thousands of consoles and games that we can't sell in retail stores anymore because no one wants them, and we need to get rid of it. So let's start a mail order wholesale business. That's what they were thinking. Also, it never hurts to invest in a little more of that American real estate, right? I mean, a little bit of space in LA in the early 90s was bound to appreciate in value, right? I would think. Anyway, NEC starts TTI because of honor and love or whatever, and I've seen some stuff at this point about why the TurboGrafx failed, but I'm still wondering why our explanation was trash. Especially given the fact that there's no way Tom Kalinske can be credited for downing a console that was already dead before he got there. But then Shmup Junkie hits on it, without recognizing it I think. The really real reason the PC Engine failed in America. Something we both missed. He talks about the awkward financial relationship that Hudson Soft had with NEC, which was the most boring part of the Gama Sutra article that we both read, if I'm being honest. But it's also maybe the most important.
Unlike NEC, Hudson had made plenty of money on the TurboGrafx, despite its poor sales. Paid royalties by NEC for every console they manufactured and every HuCard that was sold. Hudson had far less to lose.
You see, despite NEC losing so much money over the failure of the TurboGrafx-16, Hudson Soft, the primary game developer of the console, still walked away with a huge amount of profit. That's because they owned the intellectual property rights to the console's actual motherboard, which they designed themselves back in the mid-80s, as well as the HuCard cartridge format. Thus, for every single console that was manufactured, NEC had to pay a royalty to Hudson Soft. Just as for every HuCard-based game that was manufactured, third-party producers had to pay a royalty to Hudson Soft. NEC, on the other hand, only made their money on the basis of hardware sales, an arrangement that would ultimately prove to be disastrous because of the business decisions that it would incentivize. So what is the really real reason why the PC Engine failed in America? It was the business deal with Hudson Soft, because the only way for NEC to make any money off of the PC Engine was hardware sales. And so naturally that incentivized them to pump out as much hardware as possible, including as many accessories as they could possibly dream up. Why else was a $400 CD-ROM drive released after a year on the market? Because they needed revenue from the hardware sales. And they probably also wanted a way around having to pay HuCard royalties to Hudson Soft, because Hudson Soft didn't get paid royalties for games made for the CD-ROM drive. They didn't own the property rights to the CD-ROM technology. But surrounding the PC Engine with all of this extra hardware had the same exact effect that it had on Sega when they did the same thing to the Genesis. It hurt it. Because you went from selling a $200 game machine to selling a $200 plus $400 plus whatever else dollar console, and you end up scaring off both casual customers and game developers who don't want to spend time and money making games for complex add-ons that sell less than 1 million units worldwide. They'd rather just, stick with Nintendo at that point. We could talk about TTI and all that other stuff, but it's game over, man. The Turbo Duo was just NEC trying to sell more of that hardware in order to make some sort of return on their investment. And by the way, the existence of the Turbo Duo only corroborates our hypothesis, because it's essentially an admission that no one wanted to buy a console that was scattered across all of these separate costly add-ons. NEC was forced to respond to the market and stick all that stuff back together into one console, where it belonged in the first place. They should have never nickel and dimed gamers the way that they did, but when they can't make money off of royalties and software the way Hudson Soft did, can you blame them? Because it's a commonly known fact that video game companies don't really make their real money off of hardware. Nintendo and Sega both, in fact, never really profited off their consoles, but instead they sold their consoles at a loss in order to incentivize a higher number of base customers. From there, they made their real money off of licensing the right to sell game cartridges for the console. And just like Hudson Soft, they were paid a royalty for each and every one. So by taking on the hardware business and being mostly divorced from the software side of the formula, NEC was virtually destined to lose. The rest of Shmup Junkie's beautiful, well-edited video is yet more celebrating the triumph of the PC Engine, and sure, from the point of view of a niche hobbyist and game collectors...
This is a video game. I gotta say this again. I couldn't believe this was a video game.
The PC Engine is pretty great, especially before the prices for games were driven up to their current heights. Today, Bonk's Revenge can go for around $80. Blazing Lasers can cost even more. It used to be that the PC Engine versions of these games were a lot cheaper, but not anymore. Gunhead, the Japanese version of Blazing Lasers, is even more expensive these days. Ys Books 1 and 2 for the Turbo CD can go for more than $200. Then I found some guy selling Magical Chase for $15,000 on eBay.
Wow.
But the reality is this. The console was definitely a failure. Not crappy, not bad, just, not successful. Indeed, sometimes some of the very best things are less than successful endeavors. I mean, look at Creative Cat Productions. And speaking of CCP, we get to the end of Shmup Junkie's video. There's some more about how we're never going to forget the PC Engine. It's super awesome, gotta love it. But hey, where was CCP, bro? Shmup Junkie mentioned our hypothesis about the failure of the TurboGrafx-16 multiple times, calling it rubbish. He even referenced our joke about confused parents going to the store to buy kids a video game console. He referenced our comments on the popularity of the Bakuramon video game, driving sales of the PC Engine, but he never gave us any credit for any of it. And he never really demonstrated why the argument from our video was trash. He just said that it was. To be fair, I never gave any explicit credit to Christian Nutt, who's the guy that actually did all of those interviews for the Gamasutra article, which has in turn given birth to virtually every YouTube video ever made on the history of the TurboGrafx-16. And that's not an exaggeration. Anyway, I enjoyed Shmup Junkie's video, gave it a like, and then went to the comments section to bear my grievance over being trashed and yet left uncredited. We're definitely making a response video about this in the future. I was bummed you didn't mention our channel since you referenced our video's hypothesis regarding the role that confusing and expensive add-ons played in burying the TurboGrafx in America. You even referenced the image we generated of confused parents going to the store to buy consoles for kids. Still, I'm glad you made this. The TurboGrafx certainly did find its fan base. I mean, it had a small fervent fan base pretty much from day one. Anyway, we'll definitely have to put something together, but probably not until later this year. And we'll make sure to highlight your video and channel. The Shmup Junkie soon replied,
"Hey man, I'm glad you enjoyed the video. And honestly, all I did and showed wasn't directed at your video at all. It wasn't until you pointed it out in my first video, and I went back and watched yours, that I saw many of the references. I was definitely not targeting your video. I'm sure I'll enjoy anything you put together in the future too, as I enjoyed your first one."
End quote. Well, here you go, Mr. Shmup Junkie. As promised, one response video. It's obvious from his response that Shmup Junkie, if that's even his real name, didn't realize how much our video had influenced his analysis. And really, it was only by going back and reassessing our original video, in comparison to his, that I even realized how influential that Gamasutra article by Christian Nutt was, not just for our video, but everyone else's. It just goes to show you the danger in attempting to transform all of these various interviews and bits of information scattered across the internet into a single coherent narrative. Often what little information that remains about old video game consoles is dubious, or the only sources are the memories of people who experienced this stuff more than 30 years ago. But human memory is highly faulty, and we're all prone to bias. At best, all we can do is cobble together the least self-contradictory narrative that we can, and hope that it's entertaining, or that people get something of value out of it. I still think that I'm 100% right though. So, what did we learn today? The long-cherished story about the PC Engine being super popular in Japan is most likely a myth. or at the very least a gross exaggeration. The console launched in 1987 with a paltry assortment of games that wouldn't become the shmup paradise that we all know and love for at least a few years. It would eventually sell around 10.5 million units, including the TurboGrafx-16 sales, but it would never even come close to reaching the relevance maintained by Nintendo. And it's doubtful that the console would have ever even made the transition statewide if not for the hyper-inflated economic bubble that afflicted Japan in the 1980s. The PC Engine's transition into becoming the TurboGrafx-16 was, indeed, an abject failure. Sales were remarkably low. In spite of the first run of production being extraordinarily high, NEC never sold the original run of 750,000 consoles, and thus the surplus reduced NEC's American business to an order-by-mail wholesaler out of Los Angeles, California. Go Bruins! The most common explanation, as far as I know, has always been that NEC in America must have failed to properly market the console. After all, no one remembers it, right? But the Gama Sutra article reveals that NEC spent $10 million in advertising, which was basically on par with Sega's initial spending for the Genesis. And many television and print ads have been preserved by the internet. Further, the console was heavily featured in all of the popular gaming magazines of the time. In the fall of 1989, we knew the TurboGrafx-16 existed. We just didn't buy it. And you know what? We didn't buy the Sega Genesis either. I mean, a few people did. Our family certainly got one, but we weren't the norm. Until 1991, the Sega Genesis, just like the TurboGrafx-16, was a niche product. It was Nintendo that ruled the day. 1989 was one of the best years for Nintendo yet, and Super Mario Bros. 3, one of the best games of all time, came out just a couple of months into the following year. Yes, eventually Tom Kalinske would cut the price of the Sega Genesis, and yes, Sonic the Hedgehog helped drive Genesis sales. But even then, it's not like Sega won the console war. Sega's success was limited and very short-lived. Eventually, the Super Nintendo caught up, and by the mid-90s, it was a smashing success. And yet the TurboGrafx-16 wasn't even relevant by then. NEC made some desperate attempts to correct the situation by releasing yet more hardware. The Super Graphics was released in 1989 as a spectacularly unsuccessful attempt at upgrading the PC Engine. The Turbo Duo came out in Japan in 1991, effectively solving the problem of having the TurboGrafx spread out across $700 of separate hardware, but it was too little too late. NEC by then had effectively stopped supporting the enterprise in America, no doubt crunched by the post-bubble economy that would see them virtually exit the consumer electronics industry altogether, an industry they previously enjoyed great success with. TTI Turbo Technologies no doubt did a good job to promote the remainder of the endeavor, but much like NEC itself, they were more or less just a zombie enterprise at that point in time. Dead, but somehow still moving. We stand by our original claim. The TurboGrafx-16 died in America because American parents were not willing to purchase a video game console that came spread out over more than $700 of separate hardware pieces. Why do that when you can get a Nintendo or a Sega complete in the box? It made no sense. But while the TurboGrafx-16 may have died commercially in 1989, as you can plainly see from the existence of this video, the Shmup Junkie's entire channel and many of our videos dedicated to its amazing library of games that spanned roughly 7 years of video game history, the TurboGrafx-16 spiritually lived on. The TurboGrafx-16 Mini, which came out in 2020 and still is by far our favorite retro mini console ever made, showcases some of the greatest games released not just for the TurboGrafx, but also the PC Engine, the Super CD-ROM drive, and the incredibly obscure Super Graphics. If the Shmup Junkie got anything right about the TurboGrafx-16 and PC Engine, then it's this. In spite of maybe selling a little bit less than expected, okay, a lot less than expected, it still wound up having a fantastic library of games that today are worth the time of anyone who's not afraid of a little bit of challenge and a whole lot of beautiful pixel art and smoking chiptunes. So that's the TurboGrafx-16. I'd like to think that despite not having much of an impact on the past, that it could have a definite place in the future of gaming, especially as the love of retro and indie gaming continues to grow in the face of a crumbling monolith that is so-called AAA gaming. And just as R-Type made a recent comeback on modern consoles, and if you haven't seen Shmup Junkie's review of that, you should check it out, perhaps one day we'll get another entry in an outstanding series, such as Bonk's Adventure, Soldier Blade, or maybe something like Newtopia or Devil's Crush. Who can say? The possibilities are great, just as long as we're all still game to support it. Thank you very much for watching our comprehensive overview about the really real reason why the TurboGrafx-16 failed in North America. We've given you our side of the story, so now we want to hear from you. Why do you think the TurboGrafx-16 failed to catch on? And do you think Shmup Junkie is ever going to plug our channel? Either way, please check out his channel and give him a sub, and let us know what you think in the comments.
Remember, kids, listen. Don't let them mislead you. The Turbo Duo was the first CD game system on the market, but it's definitely not the last.
Thank you for that, Johnny Turbo. It most certainly wasn't the last. Bye-bye now.